Hello and welcome to Cityline Book Club. My name is Mairlyn Smith and I'm going to be the host this month. I'm so excited. I'm in my hometown of Vancouver with fellow Vancouverite Brian Payton, and he wrote this month's book, The Wind is Not a River. And I got to tell you right off the bat, so you're not nervous, I loved it.
Thank you.
I'm a real book nerd and I just loved your prose. You paint pictures.
Thank you.
Do you sit around all day and go, how am I going to say something about somebody who is orthodontically, what was it you said? Challenged. No, but it was, you had a wonderful line. It was this one thing about smiles. It was a predicament. Oh my God. Do you sit around and think about that all day?
No, but when I find that the writing isn't going, I just feel I have to look more closely. I have to look deeper into the scene, and so that brings up the details that I think make it hopefully an enriching reading experience for the reader.
Oh, totally is. Okay, let's start with the title, because when I saw the book title, I went, "The Wind is Not a River." I don't know what that means, but I really think I want to find out what it does mean. And I did find out in the book, but I still want to know why you came up with this title for the book.
Well, it's a bit of a head scratcher in some ways, a bit of a koan you have to meditate on, but you're the kind of reader I want, somebody who is intrigued enough to solve the question. And it is revealed about halfway through the story about how important this phrase is to the people in the book, but it's a phrase that comes from the Aleutian Islands where the story is set, and it comes from the native people who live there. So it's a phrase that they use to each other in times of stress and times of hardship to get them through these events. And so when one of the main characters realizes that, it becomes something very important for him and helps him survive.
I love that. Now, I don't want you to give away the plot, because I hate when you get reviews and you go, well, what was the point? I need to read this now. So in 50 words or less, you're the author. Give me a little tantalizing little thing about give me the plot of the book.
The Wind is Not a River is a story of John Hill and Easley, and it is set against the backdrop of the only battle of World War II to be fought on American soil, which happened to take place on Alaska's Aleutian Islands. It is, on one half, a physical and existential survival story. Yes. It is a day-by-day, gripping survival story. On the other side, it is a story of a woman who's been left behind in Seattle, Washington, and told essentially to stay at home and stay safe and stay out of harm's way. When she realizes that her husband is not coming home, he's not answering anybody's calls, and no one's heard from him in months, and that no one will be looking for him, she sets out on an epic adventure to find him. She has to.
Time's up. Okay, that's your 100 words. I think you went over, but that's the essence of it. Is that wonderful searching for the woman, for the man you love, and that quest. Now, John Easley, your main character, such a solo guy, and I mean, I fell in love with him. So where did he come from in your imagination? Like, who is this guy? Did you know him? Like, why did you make him a journalist and not a soldier? Who is he?
That's a great question. During World War II in Alaska, the U.S. government had a major media blackout on what was happening there. They let some details out, they had to, but they clamped down on the journalists. And when I, in my research, realized that they'd rounded up the journalists and sent them home, and that 2 of them tried to sneak back into Alaska but were caught. And the government said, if you try this again, we'll put you in prison. I knew that I had my character to go into this story because I've worked as a journalist and continue to work as a journalist, and I knew that character. So he came to me sort of fully formed in some ways about what he was doing. I didn't know who he was, and so I learned about who John Easley is in the course of writing the book as the reader learns. So he was in some ways so much easier for me to get into the story. Helen was more difficult for me because I've never written a female character before.
She was written well.
So I had to take a couple of stories at her, but once I had sort of let the veil fall away, that the distance between us, between old people, young people, between races, between the sexes is really so small. When you let that fall away, then you can inhabit the character.
I loved that you chose this area that I had heard of growing up, being from Vancouver. Right. And my dad was, he was in the Air Force during World War II. Okay. And he was stationed where they actually flew the planes over to Fairbanks to do the switch with the Russians.
The Lend-Lease program with the Russians. Yeah.
So I knew about that, but I did not know about the Aleutians. Where did you discover, how do you know about this?
Before I moved south to Canada, I lived in Alaska for 3 years as a kid.
South to Canada?
Yes.
I've never heard of that one before.
Not many people can say that. So I lived in Anchorage, Alaska, and as a kid I was fairly precocious and I thought I knew everything about everything. But about World War II, I thought I had a grasp of what was happening. When I'd heard that there was a battle in Alaska and that people in the lower 48 states and beyond had no idea about it, I couldn't believe it. And so I filed it away as something to learn about, first and foremost, and secondly, what would be a great backdrop for a novel.
And I love that you come from nonfiction too, because the detail that you've done in your research, I mean, I was there. And so you went to the Aleutians, didn't
I
you?
did.
You
Yeah.
had to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I brought some of that sentiment as a nonfiction writer and as a journalist to this story. I had to go to the Aleutian Islands. I had to spend time in the community there. I had to walk the land and breathe the air essentially to bring all that back to the page.
I loved it. I just loved it. Okay, so I have two burning questions. The first one is, okay, I don't want to give anything away, so I'm going to tap dance. When John finds himself on this island, he has an airman with him.
That's right.
And you don't name him until page 80. Okay, now that really bugged me because I was afraid and I didn't know why. Did you do that on purpose, or is that just me being weird?
I think you missed that he was named a bit earlier. But,
oh, shoot.
But I called him the boy.
Yes,
and he does have a name, and it's mentioned a couple of times in the story.
Seriously, you'd called Carl before page 80?
Yeah, I did. But
there goes that question.
He's called the boy, and because the story is written in what's called a close third-person sense, you really are thinking through John Easley's mind. You're seeing through his eyes and feeling through his emotions. And so he thinks of this young man, he's only 19 years old, as much younger than him, and he is. John's 38. And so he thinks of him as the boy, and then it becomes a relationship where it's kind of a younger brother relationship, and their friendship and relationship deepens along those lines. So the boy is the way he thinks of Carl Bitburg, and that's why his name doesn't appear that often.
Okay, because I really liked that you didn't name him.
Good question.
Well, thank you, but obviously it was a stupid question because you actually did name him and I missed it. But I love that, I don't want to give that part away, but you talk a lot about spirituality and faith, and then there's this part about not being religious in the book too. And I found that was a real juxtaposition. And so was that a purposeful one that you wanted John to, okay, please just talk about that.
These are two different characters. John and Helen Easley are two very different people who happen to be in love and be married. And Helen is a very spiritual, religious person, and she happens to be a Catholic. And so her faith is kind of a bedrock for her. It's a foundation upon which she lives her life and finds the strength to go out and look for a husband. John is much more dubious about these kinds of things, and he finds himself on the island as a non-believer and facing the ultimate end. He's facing his death. And what does he come away with? Well, we'll let the readers find that out. But they have two very different ways of looking at what we're doing here together and what is going to be beyond. And so I find those two ways of seeing the world very interesting, and to watch them play off each other.
And but they were both sort of saying the same thing in lots of ways. I mean, they both had ultimate faith in something.
In something.
I know. I love that. Okay. One of the things that I was really, really interested about is that, okay, so he's on the island and she's doing her thing, and you go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And did you always have that as the idea, or
yes.
did you? Oh, you did it.
Yeah,
okay.
it's funny. I've been asked this several times. Did you sort of write them separately and put them together? When I'd gotten to the end of chapter 1, which is a really long chapter, and I'd realized, okay, I've spent a lot of time with John, and I don't have a lot of questions about who he is. And so many of them pointed to a strong personality outside of himself. And that became his wife, Helen. And so when I realized that John, is a person who's a bit torn asunder, his better half in some ways is left behind. Who is this woman? Who would be with John? Who would put up with what he's done and who he is? And so when I had that, I had to write her second chapter, and then it just, they just hopscotch over each other.
So that you actually wrote the first chapter first, and then realized that, I love that. That's your whole process.
So I'm getting to know them as the readers get to know them. So I really didn't know.
Well, it does unfold. It's very much an unfolding book. And so, did you have well, you obviously knew how it was going to end.
Well, I knew how in history how the battle ends.
Right.
And so I know about the history of the war there, and I wanted to stay as close as possible to this history, but I had no idea how it would end for the characters. And so that was a real discovery for me as well.
Wow. Now, okay, the one thing that I really took away from the book was John's mention about that he had made a professional life as a solo person, as a stranger. And then this whole idea on what grief was and how he had dealt with his brother's death.
Or not dealt in some ways, yeah.
Not dealt is probably the better idea. And so I think that has to come from a real core place from you, or you're the most intuitive man I know, which means I have to marry you too, because I want to marry John. But seriously, that whole solitariness of him was intriguing to me.
Well, there's two sides to my personality as well, and this duality plays out in the book. And I'm a very social person, but I have a side of myself that is very solitary as well. And so John plays much more to the solitary side of my life, and he realizes that he hasn't given himself to his wife in some ways, to his younger brother in some ways, and now to this airman who is just revealing his life to John without even hesitating. And John still finds himself at the edge of committing to relationships. And so he has to face why he's like that, and that's part of what the story takes apart as we get toward the end.
I loved it. All right, my last question is, I'm an actress, an actor. Whenever I read a fabulous book, I go, this is going to be a fabulous screenplay. I saw this as a movie. I don't know whether this has been sold as your movie rights, you should, but have you cast who John and Helen would be in your head? And if you ever do sell this, you have to get this a clause in your whole contract.
Well, we haven't yet, so the rates are still open, although some people are knocking at the door and kicking the tires, as they say.
Yes.
But when I started writing this book 12 years ago.
Wow.
So this has been in my life a long time.
Brad Pitt's way too old.
On and off. But at the time, I thought Ralph Fiennes would be good, but now he's too old to play the part. He's too old to play the part, but that kind of actor, I think, would really, really do quite well.
Solitary man. Yeah. Ooh, so thrilled to have taken the time on Family Day here in BC, that you actually came to talk about the book. It's the best read I've had in years. You must read The Wind Is Not a River, and then we'll discuss why you think that that's the name of the book. Thanks for Cityline. Bye-bye.